Welcome to the Project Censored Radio. We are very glad right now to be joined by Jen Deerenwater, who's a bisexual, two-spirit, multiply disabled citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, and an award-winning journalist and organizer who covers the myriad of issues her communities face with an intersectional lens. Jen is the founding executive director of Crushing Colonialism and a 2019 New Economies Reporting Project and 2020 Disabilities Future Fellow. Jen is a contributor to Truth Out, and her work has been featured in a wide range of publications, including Bitch, Rewire, News, and In These Times. Jen's writing is also included in anthologies, of which there are several. Jen is the co-editor of the anthology Sacred and Subversive and is currently hard at work on her own book. Jen has been interviewed for numerous outlets on her work, and The Advocate named Jen a 2019 Champion of Pride. While raised in rural areas of her nation's reservation in Oklahoma and in rural Texas, a nomad at heart, Jen currently lives in occupied Piscataway land known as Washington, D.C. Jen, thanks so much for joining the show.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So I wanted to ask you on for a few different reasons, but I wanted to start with a recent, there have been a couple of articles recently that have just talked about the corporatization of pride and, where everyone from weapons manufacturers to Walmart throw up rainbow regalia so as not to lose out on the purchasing power of queer folks. But I wanted to ask you how, basically to put it bluntly, how does this come across to you?
Yeah. So how does this come across to me? It's disingenuous at best. And I don't even know what it is at worst. It's just awful. I remember, a little over 20 years ago when I came out and I was living in Los Angeles. And I remember every June, you'd suddenly see billboards up showing like queer people, and it'd always be liquor advertisements. It was like Smirnoff and Budweiser, Bud Light specifically, that I recall. And I remember thinking, why is it that we only matter 1 month out of the year, and it's also to get us drunk? Like, really? And I've just seen this go on and grow to the point that, you can be at a Capitol Pride Parade and you watch Lockheed Martin or Northrop Grumman, who are weapons manufacturers, go by with floats, literally with drones on them. Drones. I can't remember which one it was, but a few years back, one of them had a drone on their float. That's not pride. That's mass murder. That's genocide. Is this what our ancestors fought for? Hell no, they didn't fight for this. Target, actually, I was just kind of looking at their pride selection for this year, and I've noticed every year it keeps growing. And this year there was a t-shirt with Marsha P. Johnson and I believe Sylvia Rivera on it. And I was like, are you kidding me? If one of them walked into a Target and shoplifted food or clothes or whatever, you would chase them out of that store, tackle them to the ground, have them arrested and thrown in jail cell. How dare you? Just how dare you? You're not here for us. And we can see that with the donations that these corporations make as well. It's a game. It's making as much money and maintaining as much power as possible. And they'll do that any way they can. And so they send out these disingenuous notions of, oh, we're here for pride, come buy our stuff, and oh yeah, by the way, we're going to give money to politicians who want to take away your rights as a queer person. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I believe disingenuous at best, and then a word we can't say on air in reality at worst. But you kind of touched upon this, that pride really started as a riot, in literally and figuratively, in terms of the energy and in terms of the literal actions. And it's true that what we now think of as pride in the US started with the Stonewall riots, where cops in New York City were harassing, abusing, and otherwise targeting LGBTQIA folks for the crime of not being straight and or cisgender. The push for justice and for human rights was spearheaded back then and continuously today, predominantly by Black and Latinx queer, trans, and femme folks. And I'm curious how you feel both personally and professionally, that this clashes with the popular representation and celebration of Pride today?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not against celebrating who we are and having a good time. We absolutely should do that and have that, but not at the expense of all of our people. You know, when I look at, I'm just using Capitol Pride as an example since I live in DC and I've organized against Capitol Pride. Um, but you could see this at prides across the so-called US. You know, there's often complete lack of inclusion of indigenous people of the lands. Number one, there's never even an utterance of the term two-spirit. So as an indigenous queer person, that makes me incredibly angry. You don't get to have your pride on our stolen land. Like, that's not okay. Um, you know, it's really upsetting when pride parades require Native people and Native orgs to pay to take part in their parades. I hate to break it to you, but this is still our land. We should not have to pay to march in your stupid parade. You know, pride to me means nothing anymore. The month of June means nothing to me as a queer person. I almost never go to Pride. You know, I might go to Baltimore Pride this year just to be with one of the Native orgs that's going to be in their parade, but I don't get anything out of it. You know, there are tons of cops there. That doesn't make me feel safe. That makes me feel less safe, in fact. You know, it just it's fake. It's fake. You know, Pride should not be just a party for our most privileged of queer community members. You know, your pride should not come at the expense of our lives. And when you allow weapons manufacturers in your pride parade, that sends a very clear message about which queers you think matter. You clearly are okay with mass murder. That's not pride, in my opinion. You know, I know that I kind of keep saying the same thing, but I'm constantly so disgusted with the direction that pride has gone in this country, and this sort of heteronormativity that comes with it as well. I'm not straight, I'm not cis, I don't want to be straight or cis. I don't want that. I don't want to live in the suburbs and make babies and be married. That's not the life I want. If that's what you want, so be it. But to make it out like all queer people are just like straight people, you know, we're just like you know, I just no, we're not. I'm different, and that's okay. I think I rambled a bit on that question.
No, I think that's perfect. And I think that you also, in that way, highlighted so many intersections that are erased in the official Pride celebrations. And I actually wanted to talk to you a little bit about that too, because, you know, Pride is oftentimes highlighted in the US as starting with Stonewall, which I think is, even for, you know, people who aren't Indigenous, that's not true. You know, the fight for queer liberation was happening long before that. But I also wanted to talk about the queerness far before Stonewall, and in fact before the colonization of these lands. So how were identities regarded and treated before the advent of the United States, and how do you see colonialism as a continued attack on Indigenous peoples who don't identify as straight or cisgender?
Well, it goes back further than the creation of the United States. You know, it goes back to 1492. So some of our tribal nations had more than just two genders. Not all did, but many did. The Lakota, I believe, had 7 genders at one point in time, according to Candy Brings Plenty. So, you know, I know the Navajo do, you know, there's quite a few nations that had multiple genders. And they weren't seen as less than. They were revered. They were important parts of communities. They were important parts of our families. It was considered a blessing to have a two-spirit person in your home. We were seen as being part of what completed our circle. We were seen as bringing the balance in between men and women. We were often used as negotiators within, you know, community disputes and with the, you know, different colonizers that we've had. We've taken orphan children. Some of our two spirits went to war. You know, we have various roles, like very specific roles as well, which is why we say if you're not Native, you cannot be Two-Spirit. Doesn't mean you can't be non-binary, but you can't be Two-Spirit, because that is a very specific role within tribal nations. But you know, the where this all really started to change was when the Spanish invaded. You know, they brought their white supremacy and their Christianity, and they forced that on us. And over the years, those that were not outright murdered were just erased. They were forced to dress and behave within, you know, the white Christian gender binary, you know, and it's just gone on and gone on to the point that now our own straight cis Native relatives are oppressing us. You can see it through like tribal government legislation. You can see it within community spaces. Unfortunately, my people, the Cherokee, are pretty anti-queer. My tribe specifically, Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, tends to be much more politically conservative. We have a lot of Christian and right-wing tribal citizens, not all, but we have a fair amount. The anti-queerness is unbelievable. And not just in Oklahoma, like it's over 100,000 of us are considered at-large citizens. And so that means we don't live on our reservation. And we have a satellite group here in the DC area because our tribal nation started something called Cherokees at Large. And so we have a satellite community here. And I went to one of their events a few years back, and the things that were being said that were blatantly anti-queer were horrendous. And I don't see my tribal government doing anything to address the needs of our queer citizens. I've tried talking to one of our at-large tribal legislators, you know, and her response on anything I ask her about, from disability to queerness, is always, I don't know, it's fine, it's not a problem, or it's just all the Christians in Oklahoma. You know, so it started with the white invasion, but now our own relatives do this to us. And then within non-Native queer community, we are erased as the people of this land. Our Two-Spirit identities are erased. You know, it's just being a minority within a minority within a minority, and often feeling like no one loves you, no one cares. You could disappear tomorrow and your own people may not even care. And I don't want to say that all natives are like that, because they're not, but far too many are now. And that is one of the impacts of colonization that we see, and that I think hurts me the most. Sadly, I expect non-Native people to erase us and use us, tokenize us, mistreat us. I've sadly come to expect it, but it's really painful when it's your own people turning their backs on you or committing violence against you.
Yeah, it reminds me of, I can't remember the author, which is awful, but there was an author who was writing about the capos in concentration camps, and that was the name given to the Jews who were forced by the Nazis to be guards in the concentration camps, and stories of how they were sometimes the most brutal because they were trying to prove to the Nazis that they could be just as brutal as they were, and that this like deep psychological poisoning is something that other people have written about in Black communities. Like Black cops, for instance, can be more brutal than white ones because they want to prove that they can be just as bad as, you know, the white supremacists. And yeah, it's a disgusting psychological trend that I guess is not specific to any particular community. So we've touched upon how Pride is corporatized and basically devoid of any meaning. But I wanted to ask your suggestion for queer folks that want to celebrate and allies and accomplices. What do you think would be a radical way to celebrate Pride?
Well, it's certainly not going to be in our Pride parades and festivals, that's for sure. I mean, I would say, first of all, and this is a really big grand scale ask, but the parades need to be turned back into marches. That would also take away the need for all these corporate sponsors as well, because if it's a march, it's a First Amendment activity and you don't need expensive permits for that. Whereas a parade, you do need expensive permits. And so that's part of why we have had this corporatization of Pride, is to pay the high expenses just in city fees and stuff. So that's number one. I'd like to see them turn back into marches, not parades. But also host your own events. You don't need to mess with your local pride board and committee. Honestly, I would say don't waste your time. Host your own events, do your own things. If that includes doing direct action, if that includes movie screenings, I mean, there's all kinds of things you can do. Back in, I believe, 2017, there was a large group of queer folks and accomplices that came together actually as a response to Capitol Pride and how horrific it is. And we did something called No Justice, No Pride. And that included a lot of direct action, but it also included like a family friendly march. We did a film screening with you. You helped us. We did all kinds of events and things. So, there was that direct action, the metaphorical throwing of bricks aspect to the pride that was organized, but it was also like, no, we can have fun. We can do things to celebrate and have a good time. So I think that's really the big thing I would say is start organizing your own stuff. And also make sure your things are disability accessible. And disability accessible means more than just following the Americans with Disabilities Act, which frankly is not a very good piece of legislation. Make your things accessible. Start bringing in disabled people and like people of all disabilities, because one person's access needs are not the same as another. That's a big problem with Pride, is that disabled people aren't welcome either. And I'll just use this example real quick, but there's an event that just happened in New York City last weekend called Crip the Rainbow. And it was an entirely disability created event. It was by and for disabled queer people. And, we need to see more of that from within our communities. And we need to see the funding and supports and the resources so that our communities can have those sorts of events and actions and really take back pride for ourselves and what it should be rather than this big corporate mess.
Yeah, I think that, you keep circling back to and highlighting the importance of intersections here, because queer liberation cannot exist if there isn't Black liberation and Indigenous liberation and Latinx liberation. And it's really and disability liberation. There are so many intersections here that you can't pull away from queer, because queer people are not like just white cis people. So it's like you have to, if you're talking about queer liberation, you necessarily have to talk about all these other things. And I want to also turn to another intersection that touches on this, that you discuss personally and professionally in an upcoming anthology called We Organize to Change Everything, Fighting for Abortion Access and Reproductive Justice, that's available now from Verso Books. People can get it for free. Your access to abortion as a bisexual, two-spirit, Indigenous, disabled person. And we've talked about abortion on the abortion access on the show. In fact, I just did a show about it recently and also included some information about Indigenous communities' access, or really lack thereof, to reproductive health care. But I wanted to highlight again these intersections that are so often overlooked or purposefully, hidden and not discussed. And in your essay, you describe how disability access to reproductive health care is horrific on a totally different scale, but I don't think a lot of folks understand. And that Indigenous folks are more likely in this country to be both poor and disabled. Can you talk a little bit about these intersections and how they compound specifically in terms of access to reproductive health care?
Yeah, so those of us that are considered American Indian and Alaska Native, and I say considered because these are not our words for ourselves, but this is how data is collected on us. We actually have the highest rates of disability in the so-called US per capita of any other ethnic or racial group. I believe it's 24% of our community has a disability. Frankly, I think that number is significantly higher. There are many people who actually are disabled who don't call themselves disabled, particularly in Native community. So I honestly think the numbers are probably much higher than that. So I talk about this in the book, but the Hyde Amendment is a big part of keeping many of us from having access to abortion. So the Hyde Amendment says that federal funds cannot be spent on abortion except to save the life of the pregnant person or in cases of rape or incest. As you talked about on your last show, Indian Health Services has almost never provided abortions, even within the strict guidelines of the Hyde Amendment. And for me, example, I am on Medicare and I have Medicaid because I am disabled. Once again, Hyde Amendment rules apply to me. I can't get an abortion with my health insurance. So I have 3 forms of healthcare that are supposed to be available to me, and yet I still cannot access an abortion. Even the most basic of reproductive health care is really hard to find, which I discuss in the chapter I wrote in that book about how horrible of a time I had just trying to get my IUD replaced, because the few gynecologists in DC who put in new IUDs, a lot of them don't take Medicaid. One of them didn't even take Medicare. So I guess we just don't deserve gynecological care, period. It's very frustrating. And it's very frustrating that I've never seen the pro-choice movement, including all the years that I spent in it. I never saw them advocate for disabled people. I've never seen any of the organizations work around making their, like Planned Parenthood, for example, or other clinics. I've seen very little talk about making sure their facilities are accessible for disabled people who need abortion or other reproductive health care. We're just forgotten. I barely even see us talked about in the reproductive justice movement. And the same thing for Natives, like outside of Native community, no one really talks about our reproductive justice issues for the most part. And so there's just all these intersections that they're just forgotten. We're just thrown away, and that really comes down a lot to who's in charge. Just because you're a pro-choice organization does not mean that you support me and mine. If you're led by well-to-do, straight, cis, able-bodied white women, you're not here for me. And we see that in the pro-choice movement, all the years of all the ridiculous, worthless, liberal rhetoric, making abortions rare, but, like as if abortion is a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. If someone needs one, they should be able to have it and not be shamed and be told it should be rare. I also feel like it's been used as a fundraising tool. How many times have the Democrats been in office, in control of all 3 sectors of our federal government, and yet they've never codified Roe into law? Well, they didn't do it because 1, they don't care. They don't care. They've never really cared. And 2, it's a great way to get people to give them money. And I look at these organizations like the Planned Parenthoods and the NARALs of the world, and I'm like, yeah, you keep your doors open through the threat of Roe being overturned. And it's really sad. I spent years doing work in pro-choice spaces, and I kept saying for years, and some of us said this for years as well, that Roe's going to fall. It's going to fall. And I remember people would act like I was ridiculous for that. Like I was just some raving mad person. And it's like, no, I knew what I was talking about. And here we are. It's just a matter of whose lives are important, and whose right to have children or not have children is important. And there's a lot of aspects of reproductive health care and justice that have just been forgotten by everyone, except the right, who likes to control who does and does not get to have babies and get to raise those babies as well.
Yeah. And I mean, yeah, and I've talked about this too, that it's really about making sure that we vote for the Democrats, because other than basically pride and abortion, there's no difference. And if you really look at it, including pride and abortion, because they're not actually, as you point out, here for us when we really need them. And one thing in your that I really thought was shocking in your essay was talking about, the forced sterilization of disabled folks, and how that's not discussed in the conversation about reproductive health care and reproductive justice, and how, and I've been part of the pro-choice movement for a long time as well, and I didn't know that about, about disability justice. And you're right, I didn't hear about disabled folks needing reproductive health care. And it really, again, it shows the extreme, well, bigotry is a nice word. I can't think of a word that I could actually say on air. The extreme, the extreme beep of the U.S. empire and the U.S. system that that basically doesn't just want to control bodies, but wants to ensure that this sort of very twisted white supremacist, able-bodied eugenics continues.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Buck v. Bell's, the Supreme Court case that made sterilization of disabled people on a federal level legal, that still stands. I mean, disabled people are being sterilized against their will every day across this country, including our children. There are only 3 states that have total bans on the sterilization of disabled children. It's not funny, haha, but maddening, haha. Um, the Oklahoma representative that I write about in my chapter, who is from my hometown of Collinsville, Oklahoma, she's the co-sponsor for the pretty much a total ban on abortion in Oklahoma that took effect before Roe falls this summer. She loves to claim that she's so pro-life and Oklahoma is such a pro-life state, yet disabled people are sterilized in Oklahoma legally, including our children. When she was also asked in the House debates for the bill that ended up passing, do you believe that all these people who are going to be forced to have children now in Oklahoma, do you believe the state of Oklahoma has a duty to care for them and give them the money and the services they need? And her answer was, no, that's not the state's responsibility. She was also asked, and this is also in the chapter, which I find, I don't even have words for it, but she was also asked, because the bill requires that the only way to get an abortion in the case of rape or incest is that you file a police report. So she was asked in House debates, if an 11 or 12-year-old was raped by her uncle, we know she's almost certainly not going to file a police report. So under your bill, that means she can't get an abortion. Are you okay with that? And she said, yes, I am. So these quote pro-life people, I mean, we've always known this. It's always been there. It's always been blatant. People just didn't pay attention, but they don't care about life. They don't care about children. It's so clear. And it's just unfortunate that it's just now some people are listening or waking up. But even then, I don't feel like they're really listening. I don't see it. And I don't see the kind of widespread uprising that I would like to be seeing right now. Instead, I see a lot of the same tired rhetoric, the same sort of signs, stupid, meaningless rallies in front of the Supreme Court, which, I mean, you think standing in front of the Supreme Court with a sign is going to change their mind? It's not going to change their mind. And I understand the needs for mass action and things like that to bring people together, but also, it's just kind of pointless. Like, if we have to take matters in our own hands, begging the oppressor for crumbs is never going to work. And I am very frustrated at the lack of real revolution that I'm seeing. And also the tone policing that I'm seeing by the liberal, more pro-choice movement. We've seen targeted bombings of crisis pregnancy centers. And I've watched some of the response to that from the liberals and white feminists and whatnot. And it's always, we can't use violence, blah, blah, blah. Well, this is not using violence. This is defending ourselves. And if the people with privilege and power, including in the pro-choice movement, had actually risen up and used their privilege and power, we would not be at this point. I feel like we've reached this point for a lot of reasons, and there's a lot of blame to go around. And a lot of that comes out of the reality of having white, straight, cis, able-bodied, well-to-do women making the decisions on abortion and reproductive health care access for all of us. That is the problem.
Yeah. And as you put it, they get to define what's okay. And then the people that are left out, which is the majority, are just supposed to sit down and take it. And then they get mad when they fight back. And Yeah. I mean, if Pride was a riot, and if, when was the last time anything changed in any country because people ask nicely? I can't
Yeah.
think of anything.
No, it's asking nicely is not going to get you what you need. It's not. It's going to take mass action, real revolution, and on multiple levels. I mean, everything is so awful in the US. I mean, you just pick any issue and it's like, oof, things are bad. I mean, the level of state surveillance that's growing. I mean, it's now legal to have border patrol and federal agents just breaking into your house and assaulting you if you live within 100 miles of the US border, which includes,
Most people.
yeah, it's 2/3 of the US. It includes entireties of states like Massachusetts and Hawaii. It includes those of us living in DC and New York, um, and that's, it's terrifying. Like, how do we rise up when this is the reality? Also, something that I wanted to mention is the backlash by the misogynists out there and the way they're using our civil courts to keep, women and femmes quiet, whether it's about abuse or possibly this. The editor for this anthology had actually asked me when I talked about my ex-partner in my particular abortion, she asked me, like, are you sure you want to include this? He could sue you, or he might sue you. And I said, well, only 2 people know who he is. This is not like, he's not going to be known unless he does sue me. Also, I have no money, so it'd just be stupid and pointless to sue me. But that's the reality. And after this Johnny Depp and Amber Heard case, it's even more terrifying. So it just, the ways in which we're being silenced they just are numerous, and they keep growing, but they're not going to stop if we don't fight back. Real change, real revolution. It's not going to come from writing letters to Congress. It's not going to come from standing outside of the Supreme Court. It's going to take some real change, like tearing down of empires change.
And this is coming from someone who worked on Democratic campaigns. So this is not.
Yes. I credit the Democratic Party for turning me into a hardcore radical leftist.
Well, this is the first time that I can think of a reason to thank the Democrats. So thank you for bringing us radical Jen.
Yeah, I mean, I was pretty invested in the system at one point. I was still more radical minded, but I had this mindset of, well, this is what we're stuck with. I've got the privilege of a higher education. I need to go be in this system and try to reform from within. And after 10 years, I went, no, there's no reforming from within. It works exactly as it's intended to. And the Democrats are not my friend any more than the Republicans are. I got called a squaw and an engine and sexually harassed and heard and saw all kinds of despicable things being done by some of even the furthest left Democrats in Massachusetts, which, is supposedly this very liberal state. So, yeah, real change. And it's not going to come through our parties and the government. That's not how real change is going to happen. You got to fight back, people. And I do mean fight.
Very well put. Well, Jen, tell folks where they can find your work and follow what you do.
Yeah, so you can find me on all the social media outlets. It's at Jen Deerenwater. I also have a website, jdeerenwater.com. You can follow my work as well with my organization, Crushing Colonialism. We're an Indigenous media org. So we're at crushingcolonialism.org. And also go get this free ebook from Verso Books. It's versobooks.com, totally free. It's amazing. There's lots of great pieces in there, not just on abortion and access in the US, but across like other countries. There's incredible pieces in there. And Verso has other free ebooks that come out all the time. So you should just keep an eye on them.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining Project Censored.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.